Okay, so here we are in The Americans, the National Experience by Borston, chapter titled The Rooted and the Uprooted, page 175. Now I have a little note in the front, page 175 to 78, the anti-progress, anti-modern way of life in the South. So we are about to have evidence of this, the South, the culture of the South was different from the culture of the North. And the fact that they cleaved and ended up in a civil war is no wonder. Factors fed the mania for cotton and lived off that mania. Every factor aimed to control more and more cotton. Every planter aimed to produce cotton so that he might free himself from debt to the factor in some year, which miraculously combined bumper yields with high cotton prices. To this end, the planter wanted more land and more slaves. But his neighbors all had the same idea. As he produced more cotton, so did they, and the increase in the cotton crop helped keep down the price of cotton. Still, the cotton mania went on. To sell cotton in order to buy Negroes, to make more cotton, to buy more Negroes, ad infinitum, is the aim and direct tendency of all the operations in the thoroughgoing planter, a Yankee traveler thus observed in 1835. So leaving the Yankee traveler's little statement there, back to the narrator. Capitalism then grew in the South, but the capitalistic spirit did not. A rigid system confined the pursuers of profit in a prison of custom. So custom took priority. They seem to have been a conservative lot, fearful lest any change might reduce their commission. Money accumulated in the cities, but political power and the voice of the South remained down on the plantation. There's a conservative, backward society that didn't want to change, didn't want to see new ways. A new and unprecedented kind of uncommercial spirit grew in the rural South. It was one thing for an ancient European society with a feudal past and a long tradition of subsistence agriculture to look down its nose at tradesmen, merchants, and bankers. But it was quite another for a society supported by large-scale capitalist agriculture. So he's asserting that in the South, people looked down their nose at tradesmen, merchants, and bankers. The South denied itself when it proclaimed that cotton was king and yet condescended toward those who dealt in cotton. The same blurring of the facts of life appeared in the Southern attitude toward the slave trader, on whom also the cotton South became increasingly reliant. While New England and New York extolled commerce, built new merchants' exchanges and temples of public welfare, and honored merchants as their leaders, Southern heroes were the figments of Sir Walter Scott, or the caricatures of rural gentility found in the novels of John Pendleton Kennedy and Nathaniel Beverly Tucker. Never heard of either one of them. This was the heroic age of American commerce and industry, and the newly creative age of American communities. New Englanders knew it. They did not begrudge honor to men of wealth, nor did they need to extol imaginary heroes. The South, however, wrote disparagingly of the wealthy, and had few merchant adventurers to write about at all. This is this very different attitude in the South, an agrarianism, an anti-progress attitude. So capitalism is part of the spirit of a people, too. It's not just something in the water. The South's reliance on staple crops, which reached back to the colonial era, made belief in a static South plausible. For tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton meant the dominance of routine. Techniques of Southern agriculture changed slowly or not at all, so elementary a machine as the plow was adopted only gradually and only in scattered places. As late as 1856, many small farmers in South Carolina were still using the crude colonial hoe. There was little change in the cotton gin house, or baling screw between 1820 and the Civil War. Slave laborers were proverbial inflexible, uninterested in new ways of doing old jobs. So part of it was resistance of the slaves. You just get the slaves to do the job, and as long as they're doing some work, that's as much as you can get sometimes, I guess. An outward sign of changelessness was the South's everlasting quiet. When a northerner, accustomed to city bustle, traveled through the peaceful countryside, he was tempted to think that nothing was happening. Southerners warned him he was wrong. What had always been happening in the South, they now said, was not raucous change, but quiet organic growth. In the soil God worked without clatter. Southern cities, also fearing fire, smoke, and noise, passed ordinance prohibiting the use of steam power. Quote, "Why are our mechanics forbid to use it in this city?" William Gregg asked in Charleston in 1844. "This power is withheld lest the smoke of an engine should disturb the delicate nerves of an agriculturalist, or the noise of the mechanic's hammer should break in upon the slumber of a real estate holder, or importing merchant, while he is indulging in fanciful dreams." End quote. The South was equally unfriendly to legal novelties. At this time, New Englanders like Judge Lemuel Shaw were adapting the common law to the new needs of railroads and laborers newly organizing for collective bargaining in the cities. They were ingeniously elaborating the corporation to serve a new purpose, to gather pennies from small investors to encourage the boldness of large investors to create legal hybrids for any enterprise. This was the age of general incorporation laws, capital G, capital I, capital L, which freed businessmen from the need to specialize in legislation every time they wanted to set up a company with limited liability, and provided simple procedures for creating new business entities. But Southern states generally were as slow to innovate for this as for any other purpose. The joint stock company, by which Northerners collected resources from the whole community to build large factories, did not appeal to the Southern mind, nor fit Southern ways of doing business. Business corporations, the creatures of lawyers, were born of small print. For Southern gentlemen, debts were extremely personal. Washington, Jefferson, and countless others strained to meet obligations assumed in a chivalrous or thoughtless moment when they had countersigned a note for a friend. Any gentleman would willingly face ruin to meet his debts of honor. How could he hide behind statute books to limit his liability for just debts? About 3/4 of the manufacturing of the whole United States was carried on by joint stock companies, but not in the South. Quote, "If we shut the door against associated capital and place reliance upon individual exertion," warned William Gregg, the pioneer of Southern cotton manufacturing, "we may talk over the matter for 50 years to come without effecting change in our industrial pursuits necessary to renovate the fortunes of our state." End quote. Some people were speaking against it, but so be it. It goes on a bit further, but I think you get the point. The South was pretty backwards culturally. Now we go to the World Book Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 4, CI through CZ, page 475. There was a big disparity in resources in 1860. In the North, 71% of the population. In the South, 29%. Bank deposits. The North, 81% of bank deposits. The South, 19%. Railroad track mileage. The North, 72%. The South, 28%. Factories. The North, 85% of the nation's factories. The South, 15%. That's even out of disparity if you look at population. Per capita factories in the South was lower than the North. Just per capita factories, but absolute numbers was drastically lower. So the South, a lot of people say there's different reasons why the Civil War started. Some people say if Lincoln wouldn't have sneezed the day before Sumter was shelled, or if there was a fence in a different place, this or that battle would have been lost decisively or won decisively or whatever. But it actually was a very, very deep cultural cleave that was bound to erupt at some point, and people had been saying